I found him on a Tuesday morning, lying motionless in the tall grass behind my house, his russet coat matted with blood and dirt. At first, I thought he was dead, but when I knelt down, I saw his tiny chest rising and falling, his breathing shallow but present. He was a red fox kit, probably no more than 8 weeks old, and he was barely alive. My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm 47 years old. I've spent most of my life in this suburban neighborhood, working as a wildlife rehabilitation specialist, though most people just know me as the woman who takes in injured animals. I've treated countless creatures over the years, birds with broken wings, rabbits with infections, deer struck by cars, but something about this fox kit was different. Something about his vulnerability called to me in a way I couldn't quite explain. I carefully lifted him, feeling how light he was, how fragile. His eyes were closed, his body limp. There were puncture wounds on his hind leg, and I could smell the infection from where I stood. A predator attack, probably. Or perhaps he'd been hit by a car and crawled into the grass to die. I brought him inside, set up a heating pad, and began the careful work of assessment and treatment. His temperature was dangerously low. His heart rate was irregular. He was dehydrated and malnourished. Every sign suggested that he wouldn't make it through the night. But I'd learned long ago that animals had a will to survive that often defied medical prediction. I cleaned his wounds, administered fluids, and wrapped him in blankets. Then I sat beside him through the long night, monitoring his breathing, whispering encouragement, willing him to hold on. By morning, his eyes had opened. They were bright amber, alert despite his weakened state. He looked at me with what I could only interpret as recognition, not of me specifically, but of the fact that I represented safety, care, survival. In that moment, I made a decision that would change both our lives. I would save this fox kit, no matter what it took. The first week was critical. The fox kit, whom I named Rusty for the color of his coat, required constant care. I fed him every 4 hours using a bottle and specially formulated formula. I cleaned his wounds daily, applied antibiotics, and monitored his vital signs obsessively. I barely slept, afraid that if I closed my eyes for too long, he would slip away. But Rusty fought. With each passing day, his strength increased. His eyes became brighter, more focused. He began to recognize my voice, to respond to my presence. When I approached his enclosure, he would make soft, chirping sounds, a vocalization that seemed to express both greeting and gratitude. By the second week, he was eating solid food, small pieces of meat that I'd prepare specially for him. By the third week, he was moving around his enclosure with increasing confidence, his injured leg healing, his body filling out as proper nutrition restored his strength. I found myself spending more and more time with him. I'd sit in his enclosure, watching him explore, play, learn about the world. He would climb into my lap, rest his head against my leg, and I would stroke his soft fur, marveling at how quickly he'd transformed from a dying creature into a vibrant, curious animal. My friends thought I was crazy. "You're getting too attached," they'd warn. "He's a wild animal. You need to remember that." But I couldn't help myself. Rusty had become more than a patient. He'd become a companion, a presence that filled the quiet spaces in my life that had been empty for too long. I'd been alone for 5 years, ever since my divorce. My work with animals had filled much of that loneliness, but there was something different about Rusty. Perhaps it was because I'd saved his life, or perhaps it was because he seemed to genuinely care about me. Whatever the reason, I found myself falling in love with this small creature in a way that both thrilled and terrified me. By the time Rusty was 4 months old, he had become my constant shadow. When I moved through the house, he followed. When I sat down to work, he curled up at my feet. When I went outside, he stayed close, his amber eyes always tracking my movements, his small body always within a few feet of mine. I'd gradually expanded his living space, creating a large enclosure in my backyard that allowed him to experience the outdoors while still being contained and safe. But even with all that space, he preferred to be near me. He would follow me from room to room, sleep in my bedroom, eat from my hand. I knew this wasn't ideal. I'd studied animal behavior extensively, understood that wild animals needed to develop independence, needed to learn to fend for themselves. But I also knew that Rusty had been orphaned, that he'd never had the chance to learn from his mother, that he'd bonded with me as a surrogate parent. I told myself that I would eventually release him, that this was temporary, that I was simply rehabilitating him until he was strong enough to survive on his own. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. I didn't want to let him go. The thought of releasing Rusty into the wild, of losing him, was unbearable. One afternoon, as I was working in my garden, Rusty suddenly became alert. His ears perked up, his body tensed, and he made a sound I'd never heard before, a low, guttural growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep within him. I followed his gaze and saw a rabbit hopping through the grass at the edge of my property. Rusty's entire demeanor changed. The gentle, affectionate companion I knew disappeared, replaced by something primal and predatory. He crouched low, his muscles coiling, his eyes fixed on the rabbit with an intensity that was both beautiful and terrifying. For a moment, I saw him not as my beloved pet, but as what he truly was, a wild predator, driven by instincts that had nothing to do with me or our relationship. The rabbit escaped, and Rusty's focus shifted back to me, but something had shifted in me as well. I'd caught a glimpse of his true nature, and it frightened me. As Rusty grew older, his wild instincts became increasingly apparent. He would pace his enclosure restlessly, his eyes fixed on the forest beyond my property. He would make vocalizations I'd never heard before, barks and yips that seemed to be calls to something beyond the fence. He was becoming less interested in my company, more focused on the world outside. I tried to ignore these signs, tried to convince myself that he was simply going through a phase, that his attachment to me would eventually override his wild nature. But I knew I was being foolish. I dedicated my life to wildlife rehabilitation. I understood better than anyone that wild animals belonged in the wild, that keeping them in captivity, even with the best intentions, was a form of cruelty. But the thought of losing Rusty was devastating. Over the past months, he'd become my reason for getting up in the morning, my purpose, my joy. The idea of releasing him into the wild, of accepting that he might not survive, that I might never see him again, was almost unbearable. I consulted with other wildlife specialists, seeking advice on how to handle the situation. Most of them were sympathetic but firm. "He needs to be released," they said. "The longer you keep him, the harder it will be for both of you. You need to prepare him for independence and then let him go." I knew they were right, but knowing something intellectually and being able to accept it emotionally are two very different things. One evening, as I was preparing Rusty's dinner, he suddenly bolted toward the fence. He'd never done this before. He ran at full speed, his body low, his focus absolute. For a moment, I thought he was going to try to escape, to leave me. My heart stopped. But he stopped at the fence, his nose pressed against the wire, his body trembling. He made a sound, a long, mournful howl that seemed to contain all the longing and confusion of a creature caught between two worlds. He was calling to something out there, something that was part of him, something that I could never be. I sat down in the grass and cried. I spent the next week making a decision that I knew was necessary but that broke my heart. I would prepare Rusty for release. I would teach him to hunt, to fend for himself, to be the wild animal he was meant to be. And then, I would let him go. The process began with hunting lessons. I started leaving live prey in his enclosure: mice, rabbits, insects. At first, Rusty seemed confused by these creatures, unsure what to do with them, but his instincts kicked in quickly. Within days, he was hunting successfully, his movements becoming more confident, his predatory skills developing rapidly. I also began reducing the amount of time I spent with him. Instead of being constantly available, I started spending hours away from his enclosure. I wanted him to become comfortable with solitude, to learn that he didn't need me to survive. It was one of the hardest things I've ever done. Rusty seemed to understand what was happening. He became less affectionate, less interested in my presence. When I approached his enclosure, he would sometimes ignore me, his attention focused on the forest beyond. It hurt, but I knew it was necessary. I was watching him transform from a dependent creature into an independent one, and it was both beautiful and agonizing. I also began taking him on walks in the nearby forest, keeping him on a long leash but allowing him to explore, to experience the wild environment that would eventually be his home. He would sniff the ground, investigate trees, follow scents that I couldn't perceive. He was learning, adapting, becoming more himself with each passing day. During these walks, I would sometimes see other foxes in the distance. Rusty would become alert, his body tense, his focus absolute. I could see the pull of his own kind, the call of his true family, and I knew that the time was coming when I would have to let him answer that call. The months of preparation were the most difficult of my life. I watched Rusty transform from the gentle, affectionate companion I'd fallen in love with into a wild, independent creature. He became less interested in human contact, more focused on his instincts and his place in the natural world. I documented his progress, taking photographs and videos, recording his development. I told myself I was doing this for scientific purposes, to contribute to the knowledge of fox rehabilitation. But truthfully, I was doing it because I wanted to preserve memories of him, to have something tangible to hold on to after he was gone. By the time Rusty was 8 months old, he was fully capable of surviving in the wild. He was an excellent hunter, strong and healthy, with all the skills he needed to thrive. The only thing holding him back was his attachment to me, and even that was fading as his wild nature reasserted itself. I began the process of finding a suitable release location. I consulted with local wildlife authorities, identified a protected forest area about 20 kilometers from my home, and made arrangements for his release. The date was set for a Saturday in early autumn, when the weather would be mild and food sources would still be abundant. As the release date approached, I found myself oscillating between relief and despair. Part of me was ready to let him go, to accept that this was the right thing to do. But another part of me wanted to keep him forever, to find a way to make our relationship work, to deny the reality of what he was and what he needed. I spent the final week before his release doing things I'd been avoiding. I held him, stroked his fur, looked into his amber eyes, and tried to communicate everything I felt. Gratitude for the joy he'd brought me, apologies for keeping him captive, hopes that he would thrive in the wild. He tolerated my affection, but didn't reciprocate. He was already moving beyond me, already becoming something I couldn't hold on to. The morning of Rusty's release arrived gray and cool, the sky threatening rain. I loaded him into a secure carrier and drove to the forest location I'd selected. My hands shook on the steering wheel, and I had to pull over twice because I couldn't see through my tears. When I arrived at the release site, I sat in the car for a long time, unable to move, unable to accept that this was really happening. Rusty made soft sounds in his carrier, sensing my distress, perhaps understanding on some level what was about to occur. Finally, I opened the carrier. Rusty emerged slowly, his nose twitching as he took in the sense of this new environment. He looked at me, his amber eyes meeting mine, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of recognition of the bond we'd shared. Then he turned away. He moved into the forest with purpose, his body low, his movements confident. He didn't look back. He simply disappeared into the trees, becoming part of the wild landscape that was his true home. I stood there for a long time, watching the spot where he'd vanished, hoping he would return, knowing he wouldn't. The pain was physical, a crushing weight in my chest that made it difficult to breathe. I'd known this was coming, had prepared myself emotionally, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of losing him. I drove home in silence, unable to listen to music or podcasts, unable to do anything but sit with my grief. The house felt empty in a way it never had before. His enclosure in the backyard seemed to mock me with its emptiness. His food bowl sat unused in the kitchen. For the first time in months, I was truly alone. The weeks following Rusty's release were the darkest of my life. I went through the motions of my work, treating other injured animals, but my heart wasn't in it. I found myself constantly thinking about Rusty, wondering if he was surviving, if he'd found a territory, if he was thriving or struggling. I lost weight. I stopped sleeping properly. My friends expressed concern, but I couldn't explain to them what I was experiencing. How could I make them understand that I'd fallen in love with a wild animal, that I'd allowed myself to believe we could have a relationship that transcended the boundaries of species and nature? I'd made a terrible mistake, I told myself. I should never have taken him in. I should have called a wildlife rehabilitation center instead of trying to care for him myself. I should have maintained professional distance instead of allowing myself to become emotionally attached. I should have released him sooner, before the bond became so deep. But even as I blamed myself, I knew that I would do it all again. Rusty's life had been saved because I'd found him that morning. He was alive because of me, and yes, I'd suffered for it, but his existence was worth my suffering. One evening, about 3 weeks after his release, I was sitting on my porch when I heard a sound that made my heart stop. A fox's bark, distant but unmistakable, coming from the forest beyond my property. I stood up, my entire body trembling, and I listened. The bark came again, and I could have sworn I recognized something in it, a familiarity, a pattern that seemed almost like a greeting. I wanted to believe it was Rusty, that he'd come back to check on me, that our bond was strong enough to transcend his wild nature. But I knew I was probably imagining things, projecting my hopes onto random animal sounds. Still, I stood on my porch for hours that night, listening to the sounds of the forest, hoping for another sign that Rusty was out there, alive and thriving. 2 months after Rusty's release, something extraordinary happened. I was working in my garden when I noticed movement at the edge of my property. My heart leaped, and I looked up to see a red fox watching me from the tree line. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The fox was larger than Rusty had been, more muscular, more wild. But there was something in his eyes, something in the way he held himself that seemed familiar. Could it be him? Had he come back? The fox took a step toward me, then another. I remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement would startle him away. He approached slowly, cautiously, his nose twitching as he caught my scent. "Rusty," I whispered, though I knew it was foolish to expect him to respond to his name. The fox paused about 10 feet away from me. He studied me with those amber eyes, and I saw recognition there, not the recognition of a pet for its owner, but the recognition of one individual for another, a moment of connection between two creatures who had shared something profound. He made a soft sound, a vocalization that was different from the wild barks I'd heard before. It was almost gentle, almost like the chirping sounds he'd made when he was a kid. Then he turned and walked back toward the forest, pausing once to look back at me before disappearing into the trees. I stood in my garden, shaking, tears streaming down my face. He had come back, not to stay, not to reclaim the life we'd shared, but to acknowledge me, to show me that he was alive and thriving, to confirm that the bond we'd formed had been real. It was the most beautiful and heartbreaking moment of my life. After Rusty's visit, something shifted in me. The grief didn't disappear, but it transformed into something else. Gratitude, acceptance, understanding. I realized that I'd been thinking about our relationship all wrong. I'd been viewing his release as a loss, as an ending. But it wasn't. It was a transformation, a change in the nature of our bond, rather than its termination. Rusty had come back to show me that he was okay, that he was thriving, that the care I'd given him had made a difference. He'd also shown me that wild animals could maintain connections with humans, that love and compassion could transcend the boundaries of species and nature. I began to see my role differently. I wasn't a failed caretaker who'd lost her beloved pet. I was a wildlife rehabilitator who'd successfully prepared an orphaned animal for life in the wild. I'd given Rusty a second chance at life, and he'd taken it, and thrived. I also began to understand something about myself. My attachment to Rusty had been about more than just loving an animal. It had been about filling the loneliness in my life, about finding purpose and meaning in caring for another creature. And while that wasn't unhealthy in itself, I realized that I needed to find balance, to develop relationships with other people as well as with animals. I started volunteering at a local community center, teaching children about wildlife and conservation. I reconnected with old friends, made new ones, began to rebuild the social connections I'd neglected while focusing on Rusty. I didn't stop caring for injured animals, but I did establish better boundaries, reminding myself that my role was to rehabilitate them for release, not to keep them as permanent companions. And I continued to listen for Rusty's calls in the forest. He visited occasionally over the following months, always maintaining his distance, always reminding me that he was wild and free. Each visit was a gift, a confirmation that our bond had been real and that it had transformed both of us. A year after Rusty's release, I received a call from a wildlife researcher who'd been studying fox populations in the forest where I'd released him. She told me that she'd been tracking a red fox with distinctive markings that matched Rusty's description. The fox had established a territory, had mated with a female, and had fathered a litter of kits. Rusty was thriving. More than that, he was contributing to the continuation of his species. The kid I'd saved, the creature I'd loved and released, was now a father, passing on his genes and his survival skills to the next generation. I cried when I heard this news, but they were tears of joy and fulfillment. Everything I'd done, the sleepless nights, the emotional investment, the heartbreak of release, had been worth it. Rusty's life had meaning and purpose. He was exactly where he was meant to be. I began to share Rusty's story with others. I gave talks at schools and community centers about wildlife rehabilitation and the importance of releasing animals back into the wild. I wrote articles about the experience, about the challenges of caring for wild animals, about the necessity of letting them go even when it breaks your heart. The response was overwhelming. People reached out to tell me that Rusty's story had inspired them to support wildlife conservation, to volunteer with animal rescue organizations, to think differently about their relationship with the natural world. A young girl wrote to me saying that Rusty's story had inspired her to pursue a career in wildlife biology. I realized that Rusty's impact extended far beyond his own survival. His story had touched lives, had changed perspectives, had contributed to a broader understanding of the importance of protecting wild animals and wild spaces. Years have passed since I found Rusty in the grass behind my house. I'm now in my early 50s, and my life has changed in ways I couldn't have anticipated. I've continued my work with wildlife rehabilitation, but with a clearer understanding of my role and purpose. I've also developed a richer personal life, with meaningful friendships and connections that fill the spaces that Rusty once occupied. But Rusty remains a constant presence in my life. I still listen for his calls in the forest. I still occasionally catch glimpses of a red fox that might be him, though I can never be certain. I've learned to accept the uncertainty, to find meaning in the possibility, rather than the confirmation. I keep photographs of Rusty on my desk, images of him as a tiny, injured kit, as a growing juvenile, as a wild adult. I look at these photographs often, remembering the joy and the pain, the love and the loss. I remember the lesson he taught me, that sometimes the greatest act of love is letting go, that wild things belong in the wild, that the bonds we form with other creatures can transcend species and circumstance. Rusty changed my life. He taught me about compassion, about sacrifice, about the importance of accepting that we cannot control the outcomes of our actions, only the intentions behind them. He showed me that it's possible to love something deeply and still release it, that loss and fulfillment can coexist, that the most meaningful relationships are sometimes the ones that end in freedom, rather than permanence. I don't regret saving him. I don't regret the months we spent together, or the heartbreak of his release. Every moment with Rusty was a gift, and every moment since has been enriched by the memory of him. If I could speak to him now, I would tell him, "Thank you for choosing to come back, even briefly. Thank you for showing me that you were thriving, that my sacrifice had meaning. Thank you for teaching me that love isn't about possession, but about wanting the best for another creature, even when that means letting them go." And I would tell anyone who finds an injured wild animal, save them if you can, love them if you must. But remember always that they belong to the wild, and that the greatest gift you can give them is their freedom.